is an animator and compositor specializing in motion graphics and visual effects. It is a treat to welcome Ezra because she will share her experience breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry as a creative professional in a range of roles and projects. And the entertainment industry, as you probably all know, is a highly sought after, but also notoriously difficult to break into, at least as a creative. And so I know that many of you will be happy to learn a few tips that Ezra will share with you. So a little about our guests. Hold on a second. Ezra graduated from Georgia Southern University in 2020 as a writing and linguistics major, but began her career trajectory well before then. Aside from her interest in art and animation, which she cultivated before and through college, Ezra was hard at work building her portfolio credentials since at least 2019, lining up work on several major projects, including a few with high-profile organizations. A full-time student at Georgia Southern University and serving as president of the Creative Writing Club and of the Animation and Illustration Club. She was also an intern with ASIFA South, an international association of film animation. And I think it was in Atlanta, so I think she commuted several times during the semester back and forth. She worked as director and storyboard artist for ASIFA South's 2020 animation conference promotional short, writing, storyboarding, and working on the production. She was a motion graphic animator for the 6 Degrees with Mike Rowe series, which was released on the Discovery Channel and Discovery Plus. And she was a production assistant for Netflix Episode 0 of The Liberator, which is an adult animated war drama miniseries created and written by Jeb Stewart. To date, Ezra Kirsch has worked on explainer and social media pieces for Crayola, NATO, and ASIFA South, as well as narrative works for Rise Home Stories, the Grammy Award-winning violinist Augustin Hadlich, I think it's Hadlich, and Netflix and Max. So as of August 2021, Ezra Kirsch is also core animator for Eclipse Gaming Systems, and among other roles, developing art and animation assets and video content for game production and marketing. So wonderful, incredibly diverse career. Please welcome Ezra Kirsch. Yay, applause.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm always really happy to talk about what I do, especially for students, because there's naturally a lot that goes into going from college to starting your career. So any insights I have picked up through hard-won lessons and mistakes along the way, I love passing on to students so you don't mess up the ways I did. So I have a little presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If everybody can let me know if they see it. Are we good?
Yep, it's popped up.
Cool. All right. So let's start with a little about me. Sorry, I couldn't resist. As Professor Valeri mentioned, I am a motion graphics animator by trade. Here's a couple of stuff I've worked on. I've kind of been around the industry for a while. I started actually while I was at Georgia Southern. I was picking up contracts while doing full-time studentship. So I originally got my start in marketing. I made my way to game development. My work has been kind of a little bit of everywhere between advertising and web series and this, that, and the other. Here's a compositing test. Compositing is where you take pieces of footage and you lay them together into the final video. Like here, a friend of mine made a stop motion animated short for the Center for Puppetry Arts, so I made it look all old-timey and grainy. This is what an explainer video is. This is the HBO Max series I worked on with Mike Rowe. And there's that music video with Grammy Award-winning violinist Augustin Hadlich. I don't actually remember how to pronounce his name. He's a very interesting guy. On top of that, I do puppetry. This is actually something I started doing in recent years. I have done puppetry for Dragon Con. I've done puppetry with the Center for Puppetry Arts here in Atlanta. It's actually been around for a while. There's a surprisingly thriving puppeteer community up here in the city. I've done projects with Piedmont Peachtree Puppets. I think they changed their name. And I build puppets on the side. So, as context goes for something like this, let me go into a little bit of history about myself and how I got my start and why I went to Georgia Southern, why I chose to be a writing student, and how I made my way into the animation industry. So, when I was a little kid, artfully illustrated here, I always had passion for art, passion for writing. I was one of those kids that was always quiet and drew all the time. We all knew one. Um, and from an early age, around like 13, 14, I started to get really fascinated with like old special effects. Funny story, my mom actually got me a like 3 DVD box set of like the Alien series from Walmart. When I was like a little kid, it was not what I should have been watching, but there was like a behind the scenes featurette for like the maquettes and puppets for Aliens, the second movie. And there was one of the prop master who made the little chest burster puppet and how he had like all these little wires going through to control the arms and the mouth. And it's something I decided I really wanted to do until I realized that like that's not really something that exists anymore. A lot of it is in VisFX, so I started playing around with After Effects around when I was like 15, and I just never stopped. And so now it's kind of what I do for a living. I have a bit of a professional love-hate relationship with that piece of software. So the thing was, I knew I wanted to go into the animation industry, or rather just the entertainment industry at large. But without going into too much detail, my family had a bit of hardship by the time I reached like 17, 18, when I started to have to decide what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do for college. So there was a lot of turbulence in making that decision. And I had to reconcile with the fact that by the time I was going to graduate college, my family would just not be able to financially support me. So I had the challenge of trying to make a career I really wanted in a notoriously difficult industry to enter work while I was a student. So I threw myself at a lot of things pretty hard. The thing I settled on wanting to do, though, was storyboarding. Storyboarding is a very interesting job. It exists in pretty much every aspect of visual media, movies, TVs, cartoons, especially. It's when you take a script and you turn it into a sort of visual comic. It's kind of the first visual incarnation of a story. And it involves a lot of it involves a good grasp on writing and reading comprehension and composition, both in written form and in visual language form. It's very much a form of visual writing, in my opinion, and something I have a deep passion for. I've had the fortunate of being offered to do it professionally a few times. So, knowing that, and because I had to figure out that decision so early, I kind of had a little bit of an advantage of knowing what I wanted to do by the time I got to college. So immediately I started throwing myself at clubs. I started meeting people. I started trying to network. There used to be something that ran through campus called Campus Movie Fest. It was a film competition that would circuit just 4-year universities around the country. I managed to submit a film. It won. It got screened at a festival over in Atlanta. And that's where I met Asifa South. Asifa South is actually it's the southeastern U.S. chapter of the International Animated Film Society. The abbreviation is in French. I don't remember what it actually is. And they were hosting the event where my film was screened. I met some people and I found out they did their own conferences and their own mixers. And like Professor Valeri mentioned, I started driving like 4 hours out of my way every month or so just to show up to mixers and be a familiar face and meet people. I eventually got an internship. I was volunteering. I was helping just set up tables, break down chairs, things of the like. Eventually, when I made it known that I was a writing student and I had skill in that, especially around the time of the pandemic, ASIPA was a strictly in-person events organization that needed to rapidly change to doing things online. So they very much needed people who were skilled in language and composition and just written communication just across the board. And so all of that eventually paid off and I started getting my first jobs. Yay. So through all of that, like I said, naturally I was doing everything on my own. I made some mistakes and I want to pass on those mistakes, or rather the wisdom thereof, to you because you deserve that. So these are the things that really matter when it comes to getting a job, and you can mistakenly believe that you need to have everything figured out the moment you try to enter this industry. You need to be entirely proficient in whatever your craft is, particularly you guys as writing students. but that isn't necessarily true. And a lot of it has to do with people skills. The thing is, soft skills are always going to be more important than hard skills. Naturally, hard skills are still important, but being personable, being communicative, being friendly, it really does matter. One of the best pieces of advice I got along that line, like along those lines, is probably the most important thing is just to be cool, be a cool person to talk to, be a cool person to work with, just be nice, be collaborative. Another aspect of that is that you should always be a student. Actually, always going to be a student. There's always going to be things you're learning. A mistake I made is that when I entered this industry, I tried to give the impression that I was like already a savant in what I was doing. When the reality is that you very much learn on the job. I was definitely not nearly as skilled of an animator whenever I was like volunteering and networking as I am now because I've had opportunities to learn in a professional environment. If you admit to being a student and you approach something as a learner, you are not only going to come across as more sincere, but it opens up a lot more opportunity to you. It opens up a lot more opportunity to you. The thing is, now is a really good time to network because as students, you have access to things like internships and apprenticeships, things that don't really exist for people outside of an educational environment. And you have that sort of way of introducing yourself of, hey, I am somebody who's new to this. I am somebody who's learning. I'm trying to gather information. It's a good starting point. Another thing I've learned, being multidisciplinary. If you throw yourself exclusively at the one thing you want to do, it can kind of lead to some shortcomings, particularly in that both professionally or artistically, having different skill sets did nothing but inform my ability. So being a writer very much informed my ability as an animator. There were understandings and skills that I was able to apply from one craft to the other, and vice versa. When I started puppeteering, that experience of stage performance and fabrication informed those two things as well. It's a good thing to have, and it definitely is a good talking point whenever you are networking because it makes you memorable. Also, be healthy. We will get to that later. That is much more detailed than one bullet point. So, here's the important thing. I really do attribute my education writing to what helped me establish myself in my career and just as an artist. And the writing program at Georgia Southern is really special. I believe it's the English program now. Sorry. It's really special because number one, you really do have the benefit of community. At the time, I was president of the Creative Writing Club. Some friends were president before me. Having that community of student writers that can inform your process, they can respond to your work, you have a workshop, it is quintessential to growing as an artist. To be able to have somebody approach something with a first impression that you've made and give you real first impression thoughts. That's something you can't really get online. Number two, Georgia Southern is really good about giving you education across different genres of writing. A lot of different programs, like SCAD, for instance, only have things like dramatic writing or a major for technical writing. You get a little bit of everything at Georgia Southern, and that is so useful because naturally, if I had a choice, I would have tried to learn exclusively creative writing. However, my first jobs were in drafting copy. So having technical writing, having other forms of writing very much helped me understand the rhetoric of a bunch of different fields and apply myself in different ways. And lastly, your professors are very skilled in writing. Most of them are published authors, and they will.
No way.
Thank you, Michael. They have really good perspective and are always very willing to discuss things with you. There was a professor, I don't believe he's with the university now, but he was the first to read my scripts and really boost my confidence and give me pointers as to how I can navigate my job. It's very, very helpful, and it's a good thing that you have. So, as writing as a craft goes, and why it can be very helpful, even if you don't plan to be a writer the way I did, it's its own valuable skill set. Like I said, my first jobs were in copywriting. It teaches you how to communicate effectively, which is it's not something you would expect, but it is one of the most important skills in literally any job. I can be as perfect of an animator as I want to be. I could be the next Milt Call, but if I can't draft an email adequately that delivers my work and explains what I'm doing and why and when, I'm not going to get very far. And also, in that same vein, art is communicative, and therefore I wouldn't say that all art is writing. The thing is, any form of communication, and this is something you'll learn at Georgia Southern, every form of communication involves rhetoric and that involves composition, and so does every piece of art. For me, one of the most valuable understandings I have for my college education, and particularly anytime I am making art assets or I'm making an animated video, is that I can put my head in the shoes of an audience who doesn't know the behind the scenes of my work. They don't know how the sausage is made, and kind of understand how I need to structure things so they'll be received the way I want them to be. That is a great thing to have in a writing education. The understanding that how you frame information is much more important than the content of the information, and how you make creative decisions in order to have things come across the way you need them to and make sure they're clear and make sure that they're impactful. So, as breaking into the entertainment industry goes, these are the things I think you should know. Number one, obviously, and I'm sure you've heard this before, network. Networking is maybe the most important thing to getting your career off the ground. Obviously, if you're an artist like me, there are things like Instagram and posting online, and that's good to get your work out there. But the way that this business really works, and I do believe this is how a lot of businesses work, you want somebody who's in a room in which that in that room there's a conversation about, hey, who do we bring onto this project, or hey, who do we hire? You want to have somebody who is willing to say your name, and this is how you do that. Number one, when you network, become a familiar face in a community of people who do what you want to do. That's essentially what I did. When I found out about ASIFA and I started participating in mixers, I wasn't going to strictly just kind of try to hand people business cards or like just shove my Instagram in people's faces. People don't like it whenever you try to hand them things. Or like if you, one of the biggest pitfalls you can run into when you're networking is that if you approach people and make it obvious that you are just trying to get an opportunity out of them, it really doesn't come across in a nice way. You want to just be conversational and friendly, which leads to point number two, make friends. And I do mean that very literally. It's both very helpful to have for your career, but also it rocks to have people who care about the stuff you care about and do the stuff you do in your life. Some of the closest friends I have now in my adult life are people I met at mixers. It's a great thing, and it's a useful professional asset as well. And number three, and maybe the most technically and specific advice I can give along the lines of networking, offer solutions. So you want to be a familiar face, you want to get to know people, and you want to listen. You want to be a good listener and listen to what projects people are doing, what problems they have, and pipe up and say, hey, I do this thing. Maybe I can do this thing for you. And that can even take the form of something that isn't a cultivated skill, something as simple as volunteering. That's what I started doing. I worked the box office at events. I helped set up tables. I helped just literally one of the first volunteer events I did with the CIFA. I had somebody ask me to take a piece of paper that was like I think it was a release form for people to be recorded and sprint to a FedEx across the street and get copies. Something as simple as that, just being willing to help and provide solutions to common problems can be a great way to get your foot in the door and to get opportunities like internships and apprenticeships where you can learn your craft more and get more connections, get to know more people. So, outside of networking, something that is important to bear in mind, particularly if you do pick up a job as a professional writer or really anything in which you're doing a craft, and the kind of craft that you can have a personal passion for that starts as a hobby, your relationship with it will change when you start to rely on it. Because it's one thing to like, for my own instance, love animation and to love to animate and to love Studio Ghibli movies or the cartoons that inspired me growing up, or loving my DVD box set of Alien. Those are important things. However, that changes when that becomes how you keep the how you keep the lights on and how you pay the rent. And inherently, you're going to have to adjust how you feel about that. A really common thing for particularly animation students is that if you ask them why they want to enter the animation industry, they'll tell you, I want to make a movie, or I want to be a showrunner, or I want to open a studio someday. And those aren't bad goals by any means, but they're very long-term goals and they're very difficult goals to get to. And you have to work the jobs that suck, and you have to commit to the grind. You have to grow in your career. You have to grow in your skill set. And there are going to be hard days. So you have to have something that motivates you for the entirety of your career. For me, and I do believe this is something that's applicable, and it's something I recommend everybody do in some way, find the love in what you do. For me, I love the act of animating. I love engaging with the craft. I love doing that in context. I think my microphone just mixed up. Bear with me a moment. Nope, we're good. Can everybody hear me?
We can still hear you.
Cool. For me personally, just being able to animate in After Effects every day is a really great motivator because I find the fun in it. And I still have aspirations. I still have long-term stuff I want to do, but those are secondary. And lastly, take care of yourself. Seriously, please take care of yourself. And I do have a useful metric that I want you to bear in mind as to what that means. I want you to think of yourself as 3 separate selves in this context of professionalism and working in the arts. You have your needs as an artist, you have your needs as a person, and you have your needs as a professional. And those are 3 different sets of needs that sometimes can contradict. So, as an artist, we care a lot about what we make and why we want to see it succeed. We have an emotional investment in it. That sometimes can conflict with your needs as a professional, because as a professional, you will always work for somebody, and that person will have more of a say over what is needed and how things are made than you will, and you have to learn to compromise on those things. Likewise, professionally, you're going to want to work all the time and get as many opportunities as you can. As a person, you need to sleep and you need to eat. So it's important to find a balance between these 3 things and understand where the intersections of them lie and how you can support yourself. Because ultimately, I learned this the hard way, and I would argue that I personally failed in this. Because I reached a point by about the end of college where I was working 13-hour days every day. In fact, the day I graduated, I had already moved to Atlanta for work, and I was technically graduating, although I wasn't at the ceremony. I was helping run a digital film festival. I was helping manage a contest at that festival, and I was working on a client project that was due the next day, all on one day. And I wasn't eating consistently because I would forget. I would skip sleep in order to get work done on time. And then my wrist started to hurt. I developed carpal tunnel at the age of 22, and that expanded to cubital tunnel in my elbow, and then issues with my shoulder. And the fact of the matter is that now, because I did that to myself, I have to contend with the fact that I will never be a storyboard artist. That is something I've had to give up on. Because a storyboard artist needs to be able to draw hundreds, if not thousands of drawings in a single day. I can't sit down and draw for 20 minutes without hurting. And so I kind of have a lot of pent up anger about, kind of am mad at myself retrospectively, because I had people telling me, professors at Georgia Southern telling me that I needed to take it easy. I needed to slow down, but I had that sort of grind set where I had this impression that like, oh, I can just push through it. If I just get through this, and this thing, and that I'm not sleeping for, then I'll get out all my obligations out of the way, and then I'll be able to rest a little bit. Or maybe if I push myself so hard, I'll rise above my competition. I'll make this work. And that came from that background of really feeling like this is my only option, and that I didn't have a choice because I needed to have my career off the ground by the time I graduated college. And so now I deal with chronic pain, and I have to contend with the fact that I've had to compromise on my aspirations because I didn't take care of myself. That is the big thing. You need to support your needs as an artist, as a professional, but easy to miss person. Every time you take time away from your well-being, when you don't rest, when you skip meals, that is borrowed time, and it's time you will pay back in interest. And the way I You pay back with interest. And the way I paid that back is that I've had to compromise. I'm still very much happy in my career. I love the life I've built for myself, but I had to change what I wanted. And that's never fun. And I don't want that for anybody. So, if I could give one piece of advice as to how you make a career in the arts work, how you make a career in general work, it's sustainability, because it's one thing to break in, as we commonly say in the entertainment industry. It's another to make that work in the long term and participating and taking care of yourself in a way to where you can do the job indefinitely. That is what's going to work. I've definitely picked up contracts without end dates on them and with like weird titles and maybe not fair pay. And I've turned them down, even if they were an advancements in my career, because I knew I would burn myself out. I wouldn't take care of myself. This will ultimately hurt me, even if it looks promising. And it's important to have that sense of judgment, that sense of self care for yourself. And that's not just for your well being, it is for your career, as I've said. So when I started to introduce things into my life, like financial stability and prioritizing my health and working in ways that were smarter, not harder, all of this other stuff happened. I started to be able to live a life outside of my work. I got friends. I got to do new art. I started to be a puppeteer. And so now I would say that I'm very much happy in my career and I found great success and I will continue to find success, even if I hurt a little bit sometimes. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much for that useful advice, which I know I need to listen to your life lessons as well.
Me too.
So students, you can feel free to unmute and ask questions, or you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I can ask them out loud. What questions do you have for Ezra?
Well, while everybody is getting it together, I thought that I would just ask if you would talk a little bit about the collaborative process when you're on the job, because it's in this industry, especially, it's never just one person doing, right? So how did you navigate that, and what were some of the things that you had to learn how to do?
Yeah, so that is kind of the story of my life nowadays, because currently I work in game development, which means I'm not just working with animators, I'm working with engineers, mathematicians, people who like just have an entirely different brain than I do. So one thing to bear in mind, and it's probably the most important thing to start with, you kind of have to accept that you have a Tower of Babel situation whenever you're working on a collaborative project where you're all working on the same thing, you're all talking about the same thing, but you're all thinking about it completely differently. And that's an important thing to approach. So a lot of it has to do with understanding where you exist in the project, what your role is, and how you serve the pipeline of production, and serve that the best way, particularly in a way that works best for somebody else. So with my current job, for instance, I have a 2D illustrator that will hand me pieces of art that I turned into animation. I have to hand that over to a tech artist who puts them in the game. And we have certain limitations about how big file sizes can be, how much quote unquote alpha or transparency we can have in an animation, how things are structured, how they're named. And so my job is not just to animate, it's to communicate and make sure that I am making things and handing them off in a way that best serves the next person down the line and serves the entire pipeline and the end game at the end, like at the end of the day.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of communication and being clear about what your goals are and your vision and how one thing translates to something else. Because I'm sure to the people who are doing the code, that's a whole different game too. So
Yep.
yeah.
It's all communication. Everything ever is communication. Communication is the most important thing just in any career ever.
Right. I don't want to hog the spotlight, so I'll mute myself because there's other questions.
It seems like students are being shy here. Feel free to ask questions, even if they're, not specific. to the entertainment industry. For example, I have a question.
sure.
Just wondering what your perspective is on this. I'm sure that you have heard talk of kind of the death of the humanities, and how there's a false rumor going around that humanities degrees aren't useful. Can you talk a little bit about why you think humanities degrees are useful and what students can get
Sure.
out of them?
Yeah. I think humanities degrees can be some of the most useful because we commonly misconceive that like your college education is just directly analogous to your career. And that's not really the case. Obviously, in my instance, like I'm a writing student who works in animation. I think the fact we call them humanities is very apt because these are the things we do as human people, and it's not very accurate to evaluate the humanities and particularly the arts based on their utility and productive usefulness because that's not what they are. Art predates written language, predates math, it predates permanent structures. It's kind of what we do as people. Like things like entertainment will always be around and they're important to study because they are very useful in that way. And as I've said, communication is valuable in industry. If bridge, you want to communicate the design of that bridge to the construction crews. And that is not a skill that everybody just automatically has. It's something that you can study and maybe you should study. And particularly nowadays, and particularly in my industry with the rise of things like AI generated art, something that I do want to harken back to is the value of composition because knowing how to structure something, knowing how to structure a communication for how it will be received is not something that is an automatic piece of knowledge we all have, but it is quintessential to effective communication, effective art, and effective work. And that's something you really can get out of the humanities and something I advise almost any student to at least get a minor or at least dabble with the humanities because it's so valuable in that regard. It's not going to directly lead to a job sometimes, but it will matter whenever you do get a job and it will help you excel above your competition.
Thank you. Yeah, is there like a fear of AI in your work life, or are you like,
Not necessarily. I have
Mhm.
had some headaches where like AI generated art has just kind of made things a little weird in my pipeline. We've actually at my work just entirely banned it. For me personally, a machine can't understand why it's doing something, so I personally don't believe that like a machine will be able to create something valuable because it can't engage in composition. There are also concerns about whether or not human authorship is actually a requisite for copyright protections. So generally, AI art can't really be used in like a corporate sense. So there is a lot of concern for people who work in like contract art or who do commissions because that. But personally, I believe that AI will eventually find its place maybe as a tool for artists if it ever gets ethical and isn't built off the back of plagiarism. But personally, I don't see it really eclipsing the art, like the arts industry, rather.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that perspective. So we do have some questions from students now. Sophia asks, how do you tackle wanting to work in industries that aren't exactly traditional? As a creative writer, English major, I would love to work in game development, but I have very little experience with coding and animation. What are things one could do to take up space in non-traditional workplaces or gain experience?
That is a great question. So the thing is, I don't really think you need to know those specific hard skills from the get-go. Because like I said, showing up to a professional environment or to a networking event or a mixer and saying, hey, I'm a student, I would like to learn is a great thing. And it's a great asset you can have while you're currently in academia. So like I said, I personally was animating by the time I started getting jobs. I was not nearly the animator I am now. In fact, I look back on a lot of what I made and kind of cringe a little bit. So it's okay to show up to those sorts of things and those sorts of conversations and say, hey, I don't really know anything about this, but I do want to learn about this. What can you tell me? And that's pretty much exactly where I would recommend you get your start. I would think about what role you'd want to serve in that sort of non-traditional arts environment because there are a lot of different hats and you can find basically anything. There's engineering, there's art, there's production, there's task management, there's directing, there's a whole lot of different skills. So I would focus on what interests you first, even if you don't have an exactly specific idea, maybe it's just a discipline, and then start to approach people in that field and start asking questions.
Okay, thank you. Let me see the next question. How did you feel your exploration of puppetry was impacted by your career up until that point? And or what did you learn from the leap from a primarily digital world to the practical world?
That's a really good question. So coming from writing to animation was it was a similar move when I went from animation to puppetry, because puppetry is actually considered to be a form of animation, and it's all about visual composition. So when you're puppeteering, you have to worry about not worry, but you need to think about, how do I want this character to move? How do I want it to look? And at what ideas does that communicate? If I have a character that's maybe sad and low energy, maybe I want their motions to be slow. If they're really high energy, maybe I want them to bounce around, maybe be a smaller character. And those sorts of things are pretty universal between pretty much any form of communication, particularly like when you're doing something visual like animation or puppetry. Now, granted, holding your arm up like this, particularly when you have joint problems, is its own set of concerns you have to navigate. But there's a surprising level of overlap, and it's been nice to let not just my experience as a writer and an animator inform my experience as a puppeteer, but have that come back and inform my experience as an animator. Because now, whenever I'm doing stuff at work, I have much more of a sense of performance and how visual rhetoric works and the motion of like the rhetoric of motion works. And it definitely does help all the way around.
Those are great connections. Here's a question that's similar to something we were talking about before. How likely / difficult do you think it would be for someone to become their own boss and become an indie show creator? So someone, Miles, wants to be able to animate, write, and ultimately be the showrunner. Let's see. Are there any suggestions or thoughts you have about how likely it could be for someone to do that and succeed?
Totally likely. So if you want to start your own series, particularly if you want to do that in an independent form on the internet, that is the modern era is a great time to do that because of things like YouTube and how easily you can share your work. The thing to bear in mind, though, is that there is a lot of labor that needs to happen in making a series. And you can do that yourself. It will just take longer. That's why a lot of productions have a lot of people on them. And that therefore means compensation for their time. When you're making something, there's essentially 3 pillars you need to bear in mind. There is time, there is money, and there is quality. And you have to spec into at least 2. And naturally, you want to have quality. So you either need to spend, which might mean involving other people and compensating them for their work, or you need to spend a lot of time. There's not really anything that's stopping you from going out and making a series, but you need to think about, okay, if I want to make 10 episodes, that might take me a year or 2. Unless I bring somebody else on, then I need to think about their role and how I share the work and how they inform creative decisions. If you want to make a career out of that, there's a lot of different avenues, especially in the form of Patreon, and I think AdSense is still a thing for YouTube, but of course, there are hurdles to jump there when it comes to establishing a following. It's not something I would feel totally informed on, like informed enough to give specific advice on. But I would say the thing to bear in mind is that you can go ahead and start and engage in the work yourself, or you can try to network and find other people to bring on board, which is probably what I would do, especially if you're wanting to do something more long form, because that is a lot of work to do on your own. But network, collaborate, communicate, compensate.
Great. Those are very memorable tips.
A lot of alliteration.
We have another question. In terms of communication and networking, would you say that you are more outgoing, or was building up to networking a work in progress? And do you have advice for someone who might be terrified to talk to people, or maybe some tips for that, like first networking experience?
Oh, trust me, I know this so well. I am absolutely an introvert. I imagine most of us are. Yeah, it can be scary to talk to people, but I would bear in mind one thing that like as human people, we love talking about our passions, and particularly if you're going into something like the arts. We're all trying to do the thing we're passionate about professionally, and I can promise you pretty much no one is going to be hesitant to talk about the thing they do if you ask. So for me, what worked really well is kind of finding a script whenever I was meeting new people, knowing what to ask them outright, even if like it's just kind of the same thing I ask everybody, like, oh hey, what do you do? Or hey, like, where'd you go to school? Or what's your current project? As Amanda asked me earlier. Like having those kind of preloaded questions and what you ask somebody, you get them talking about themselves and what they do is a really great starting point. It can kind of help you ease into a conversation. Because I don't think from one introvert to another, I don't think conversations are hard. I think starting conversations are hard. And once you get past that threshold, things get very easy and you feel a lot more comfortable and you feel proud of yourself in a lot of ways. So building up that library of conversation starters is definitely the thing I would advise to do, but also understand that like people love talking about these things. I'm talking about it now because Professor Valeri asked. So I would reach out to people and just ask, hey, how do you do this thing?
Yeah, you gotta have some questions in mind ahead of
Mhm.
time and also know that like people love talking to people, even if they're introverts. So once you get the conversation started, it can be easier. I think most of the professors are probably introverts too. Does anybody have any additional questions for Ezra? Let's see, I think preloaded questions is a great idea.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Dr. Conkle.
Hi.
Okay, so in our classroom, someone wanted to ask, what is your favorite Muppet? And then I wanted to ask if you have any advice for storyboarding, like software, stuff like that, because like I'm doing like film things and shot lists are incredibly important when you work with people who can't communicate.
To my
So do you have any advice for that?
Yes. So question one, my favorite Muppet is Bean the rabbit because he's just so small and he's always just kind of mistreated. And I love him in Muppet Vision, especially when he pops up as an animatronic. Perfect. As for storyboarding, so the more technical question, software. Kind of the go-to software in the industry, at least I'm not sure about nowadays, but it was a few years ago, was Harmony Storyboard Pro. Oh, hey, I can see people. Hello. Um, Storyboard Pro is a dedicated storyboarding software. It's kind of coupled with Toon Boom Harmony, which is what you see a lot of in TV animation nowadays. It's a very useful thing to learn. However, it can get kind of expensive. That's an advantage you do have. And going back to the advantages you have as students, um, student discounts are incredible, especially if you're wanting to get into the animation industry. Like I think if I remember right, I was paying maybe $10 a month for Storyboard Pro. It sometimes can be in the hundreds outside of a student, like outside of a student membership. So take advantage of that where you can. Outside of that, Photoshop and the Adobe suite are very important to learn if you want to enter this field because pretty much every studio uses them because they come in a like suite so they can pay one subscription for all software that's all compatible with each other. So I would definitely recommend learning Photoshop. If you want a cheap option though, and you probably know about this already, Procreate and Procreate Dreams for the iPad, very, very good software. I have my roommate actually is a character artist who he's worked for Floyd County on Archer, he's worked for Sony and Marvel. He swears by Procreate. Also, um Clip Studio. It's a great low budget alternative to Photoshop. That's what my friend uses. He managed to get the entirety of Floyd County Productions, the animation studio that does Archer, to switch from using Photoshop primarily to Clip Studio because it's just that powerful as a tool. So outside of that, if you want any sort of like more abstract starters, definitely start studying visual language in movies. Start looking into things on visual composition, and particularly how you block characters and common like camera techniques and negative space. Um, that's another great thing about the internet nowadays. I'm an entirely self-taught animator. I learned on YouTube. I couldn't learn writing on YouTube and the internet because I didn't have community through that the way I did at Georgia Southern. But when it comes to those sorts of technical skills, hit the books on the internet. It's so good to be able to learn that way. Especially like if you're learning on YouTube, you're not paying a couple $100,000 on a SCAD education, and it works just as well sometimes.
Are there other questions from those bodies in the room?
There's actually more. I just can't get everybody on camera. Just that you were so thorough too, that they had questions prepared. I'm like, oh, check, he answered them, she answered them, and all that stuff. I do want, like, I'm gonna ask a hard question. There are always predatorial practices in creative industries, and I just wanted to know if there's anything in specific that people should really be careful about and try to avoid.
This is definitely a like very pointed topic that is very difficult to talk about, but I do value talking about because it is important and it's something I've navigated myself. Like I said, I've gotten contracts that were not fair, and my piece of advice is that another job will always come along. I do think something to bear in mind in this industry and to be skeptical of. I'm not going to paint the industry as bad because it is a very fun line of work, but something to be hesitant about is that a lot of places will kind of exploit the sort of like movie magic that permeates this, like the cultural impression of this sort of work, and give you the idea that this is a super competitive industry and there's always somebody waiting right behind you to take the job, so you need to do whatever you can to get it to work. Don't do that. Like, you are a skilled professional. The job does without people like you. If you get a contract or an employment agreement that does not look fair, know what not fair looks like, know what you need, know like what your work is worth, know how you need to be credited to get more work. And anytime somebody tries to shortchange you, don't let them do it. The most pointed piece of advice: never work for exposure, because if you work for exposure, you are just being exposed to other people who will want to pay you an exposure. Live by that principle in this business. Like, as I said before, sustainability is the name of the game. Taking care of yourself is how you make this career work and how you advance in it. Always prioritize yourself and understand that if you need to turn down work, there is going to be more work. And having that ability to stand up for yourself, to present yourself with confidence and decide what you are, is going to lead to bigger and better for you. Always make decisions on that basis.
Yeah, that's a message to all artists. Don't work for free. Everybody thinks art should be free, at least. It's like,
Absolutely
no,
not.
if you need it, you need to pay for it. It's time and effort and all that stuff. I guess I just have one more question. It could sound stupid, so forgive me, but how do you get from, I don't know, answering phones in the industry you want to work with to moving up to other roles that are closer to the creative aspect of it? And have you ever thought of that? I know you had an internship, which is different. It kind of gives you more of a fast track into things, but I don't know if you had any advice from being in the industry for that.
Could you repeat that one more time? There's a little bit of room echo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Like, how do you go from just getting that job that gets you in the door, like bringing coffee for everybody, to the to the next level, to something closer to the creative side of things?
Yeah. So for me, like, my story was that I started working with ASIPA just as a volunteer, doing kind of the grunt work. Anytime I was doing that, though, of course, I was meeting people and they would ask me those preloaded questions of, oh, who are you? What do you do? And so I would always be able to say, I'm a writer, I'm an animator, here's my stuff. And so by doing that sort of volunteer work, doing the job that kind of just makes things happen, and I was able to show that, like, I was hardworking, I was diligent, I was a good listener, I could take direction. And like I said, those are much more valuable than the direct technical hard skills because I can say I'm a great animator, I can even show great animation, but that doesn't say that I'm good to work with. That doesn't say that, I'll be contracted for a project that has a set deadline and just completely disappear. Showing those aspects of myself, like to people who might potentially hire me or present opportunities for me, is so important versus the actual creative fields. So by starting there and making it known, hey, I'm a creative person and I want to do creative things professionally, you can start to work your way towards those things as opportunities come up. I personally have never been offered a job that didn't in some way involve somebody that I knew personally and that I had at least in some fashion worked with personally, and who also didn't know that I am an animator and I want to draw and I want to get money for doing those things. So putting yourself out there, being communicative, being a good listener, all of the abstract notes on how you go from being the person who runs to get coffee to being the person who's drawing or writing, so on and so forth.
That makes total sense, and maybe I just want to make a comment more than a question, but because I'm also in a creative industry, although in a different area,
For
I
sure.
find that that conversation piece is also about the passion that you have,
Mhm.
that passion and the knowledge that you have accumulated over the years, over all the books that you've read or the films that you've watched, and that is really valuable, and that is what connects you to other people.
Mhm.
When you talk to them and you have something in common, you appreciate somebody's style, and showing that you have more than just surface knowledge, that you actually have a real passion. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Whoever asked me what my favorite Muppet was,
Right.
good networking.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, I think I really liked your tip to like be a cool person, right? And that doesn't mean like, I don't know, like be like influencer style, but rather be a person who shows
Like,
genuine interest in other
yeah,
people and
be
has
sincere, be
interesting
nice to
things to
work with.
say.
If like a lot of projects in this field, you're going to be working with the same group of people for years at a time. So like make sure you don't smell if you're sitting at the same desk as somebody else. Be nice to talk to, be friendly. You don't necessarily have to be, you know, like the Ferrari in the room of whatever it is you do. Just be cool.
I like that advice. We have another question in the chat about competitiveness. And Miles is asking if many places try to make it seem like it's more competitive than it is. How competitive would you say it really is?
So I would say it's competitive, but not in the way that people typically understand it to be. So you might misassume that like there's just so many people knocking at the door trying to get in, and they're all like of a equal standing of how ready they are for a job in this industry. It's really more so that like yes, every job gets several hundred applications, and you need to navigate that, but there are ways in which you can create like your first impression, your resume, your portfolio, things that are just more likely to grab a recruiter's attention. Something I do a lot is like, particularly if I'm mentoring animation students, I do resume review and portfolio review. And the main gist of how you do portfolio review is that you design your site on the understanding that a recruiter is probably going through 1,000 applications a day for particularly big jobs. And you need to design it in a way that is accessible and memorable. So the competitive aspect of it is less to do with like trying to make your voice heard among a whole sea of people who want the same thing that you do. It's more about cultivating your skills and your professional presence in a way that makes you more noticeable, but also shows your willingness to learn, your readiness to work, your willingness to be collaborative and just be cool to work with. So it's not so much that like you are in a sprint along with so many other people who are just as likely to make it to the finish line as you. It's more so that you're in a marathon in which you need to prepare to best be able to complete that marathon where you're going. And plus, it's a really, really big field. There are jobs all around, and there are a ton of jobs on any given project. Like I said, I worked with mathematicians. I didn't know professional math was a thing before my current job. So like, if you have this impression that like there's only one slot and everybody's going through it, that there are jobs everywhere. There are a lot of opportunities for writers, artists, everyone in between.
Yeah, I appreciated some of the slides that you showed of work you had done animating for different live action shows. Like that's an interesting animation gig that maybe we wouldn't think about, but obviously somebody needs to design those graphics.
Mm-hmm. That's a big part of what I've done as a motion graphics animator specifically. If you've ever watched the news and you see somebody's name pop up in the lower third, that's what they're called, lower thirds. That's a job. That's essentially what I do now, where I make graphics that move. It's motion graphics. And almost every live action show involves that in some way when it comes to titles or information cards. The Discovery Channel show I did with Mike Rowe, he would have segments in which he would talk to the camera directly. And then if he was describing some history, they might cut to like a pre-recorded skit, or they might cut to an animated sequence. And that's the sort of work I did, where I would just make stuff shift around and add, visual interest to whatever he was saying, because that man is very monotone. So
That's great. Thank you. I apologize if my dog barks. Does anybody have any additional questions for Ezra? I think we asked Ezra for an hour of time, so we're almost to the end of that.
If there are no questions, I would just like to know, what are you working on personally that personally satisfies you, like personal art, not necessarily for other people?
yeah, so I've really gotten into making puppets nowadays. My other roommate and I are like kind of puppeteering partners in a way, so we do a lot of work together, and we love to make like little characters with little personalities, and just mostly just little gremlins we can use to annoy each other. So coming up with those sorts of characters and giving them voices and just character traits has kind of just been the fun thing. Sometimes I get to do that in front of a crowd, which is very nice. Obviously, when it comes to my puppeteering side of things, normally those jobs don't pay, but it's community theater, and so it's very nice to get involved with a group of artists who will care about this same zany thing and put a show on for people. It's always very nice to like see the crowd's reaction, which is something I don't always get like as a digital animator, where my work just kind of goes off to people's screens somewhere. And so like being able to tell a joke through a little sock puppet and have people laugh has been, it's been a really nice thing I've gotten to experience in recent years.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we learned a lot and really appreciate it. Thank you for your time here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we're so grateful for all of the great advice that you have offered to the students. And thank you for the time that you've given us and telling your story. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck to everybody, as I understand that you're in the middle of the semester. So as you approach the end of the semester, good luck on finals and everything, and good luck in all your aspirations. I wish the best for everybody.
Thank you. And if you find yourself in Savannah, happy St. Patrick's Day is coming up. So
That is a big crowd. No, thank you.
yeah. All right. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll have this recording processing, and then as soon as it's ready, I'll send it to you raw, and you
Awesome.
can do what you would like with it. But thank you again so much
Yeah,
for doing
thank you
this.
so much. Thank you for asking me. It's really a great honor to be able to come back and give some advice.
Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good rest of your night.
You too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.